I want to share a story that happened to me a little over half a century ago. Now that I'm well into my 70s, the memories of those horrifying events haunt me every single day. It feels as though it all took place in another lifetime, yet the images, smells, screams, and shadows of the past still linger in my dreams. Tonight I want someone to hear my tale as if I'm confessing to an invisible judge. 50 years ago, I was a young hunter, barely in my 20s. I was already skilled with a rifle and had a fair understanding of predators' habits. That was when I received a letter from an old acquaintance, asking me to come to a small town hidden away in one of the remote states. According to him, the town was in need of help. A pack of wolves had been attacking livestock, and even worse, there had been recent attacks on people. The town's authorities were calling for hunters willing to resolve the issue in exchange for a reward. The promised pay was generous, but money wasn't my primary concern. Curiosity and the thrill of a young hunter drove me to take the journey. I traveled in an old truck along a dusty back road that, at times, turned into barely visible trails winding through fields, hills, and sparse forests. When I finally spotted the first houses, I felt relieved. The journey had been long and exhausting. The town was tiny, just a few streets surrounded by farms and barren lands with forests sprawling nearby. What struck me immediately was how uneasy the townsfolk seemed. Men avoided eye contact when I stopped to ask for directions, women darted indoors at the sight of a stranger, and children stood silently, glaring from under furrowed brows as if afraid to speak or smile. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere hung over the place. At the center of the town was a small square with a town hall, a low stone building that looked more like a rural clubhouse than an official government office. Near the wide wooden doors of the mayor's house, I saw several men with rifles. They were gathered in a group, seemingly waiting for something. As I approached, I counted about a dozen armed men, a formidable crew. Their attire varied. Some wore old hunting camouflage, others heavy jackets and jeans, but each had a rifle or carbine slung over their shoulder. It was clear that the mayor had spared no expense in hiring help. As I climbed the steps to the porch, the door opened, and the mayor himself appeared, a man in his 50s, though he looked older due to his gray stubble and deep wrinkles. He was of short stature but carried himself with authority, his piercing gaze surveying us carefully. He wore an old-fashioned frock coat and a wide-brimmed hat reminiscent of old Western films. "I'm glad to see all of you who've come," he began in a raspy voice. "My name's Harris. I'm the mayor of this town, and I've called you hunters here to help us rid ourselves of a terrible plague. A pack of wolves has been terrorizing our farms for months. Livestock disappears, and we find the gnawed remains of cows and horses. But the worst part is that 2 people have been killed under strange circumstances. Their bodies were so mutilated that the doctors couldn't determine whether it was a wolf pack or something else." He paused, running a hand over his forehead as if wiping away the memory, then continued. "We can't wait any longer. We've tried hunting them ourselves, but it's come to nothing. The wolves are smart, and there are too many of them. And they attack in a way that's unnatural. I'm offering a generous reward for every wolf killed. And for the head of the pack leader, I promise you'll earn a sum you won't regret." Judging by the reactions of the gathered hunters, the promise of a bonus spurred their interest. Some smirked slyly, others' eyes lit up, but no one spoke. They all understood that blood and danger awaited, and yet the lure of money was irresistible. After the mayor's speech, we were invited inside for a meal. Dinner was held in a long hall that resembled a rustic tavern. A long wooden table, benches on either side, and simple but hearty food. Stew, baked potatoes, bread, a few pickles, all topped with a herb-infused broth. It seemed the townsfolk were eager to feed us, but beneath their polite smiles I sensed fear and unease. They spoke little, avoided eye contact, and often whispered among themselves when they thought we couldn't hear. Being young and curious, I tried to ask the villagers some questions, but they dodged them as if afraid to answer. One old man finally muttered, "This place is cursed," before falling silent, his head bowed as if fearful of saying too much. That unsettled me. I began to suspect there was more to the wolf problem than a simple rogue pack gone astray. Soon enough, I would discover just how right I was. The next morning, I had the chance to get better acquainted with some of the other hunters who had answered the mayor's call. Most were rugged men from nearby counties, but one in particular stood out for his calm demeanor and quiet manners. His name was Warren, and he came from a neighboring town. Warren kept to himself, avoiding boisterous conversations, but when we struck up a casual chat by the well, he shared a story that sent chills down my spine. "You know," he began, leaning against the stone edge of the well, "this place isn't right. Sure, the land's fertile. Corn grows nearly year-round, and the wheat yields are rich. But there have been dark stories about these woods for as long as anyone can remember." I raised an eyebrow. "Stories about wolf packs?" Warren hesitated, then shook his head. "No, stories about a witch. They say there's a woman out in these woods, a sorceress who practices voodoo or something like it. The locals are too scared to even mention her." I listened in silence, trying to mask my skepticism. Still, something about his words struck a nerve. Voodoo? Here, in our state? It sounded implausible, but Warren pressed on. "They say she used to live in the town. Something happened. She fell in love with one of the local farmers. But he was a cruel man, a drunk, and he treated her terribly, mocked her, saying she was a failed witch. Then one day, he disappeared. No body, no belongings, nothing. People started whispering that she'd sacrificed him to her dark gods. The townsfolk were furious, didn't bother with a trial. They branded her guilty and drove her out into the woods. She settled somewhere on the edge of the forest, and no one's seen her in town since. But every now and then, people find strange little dolls or hear about someone going missing. They say she's still out there, wandering the woods and performing dark rituals." "And you believe all that?" I asked, keeping my voice low so the other hunters wouldn't overhear. "I don't know, maybe it's just stories. But I've seen old records in a nearby town. Mentions of strange happenings around these parts. Just be careful, kid." Warren gave me a serious look, and we fell silent as a group of hunters and a couple of locals pushing wheelbarrows passed by, casting curious glances our way. Their expression seemed to say, "What are you two whispering about?" I felt a bit uneasy. As far-fetched as Warren's tale sounded, I couldn't completely dismiss it. Something in his voice carried a weight that was hard to ignore. When Warren later mentioned the witch in passing, most of the hunters laughed it off, dismissing it as fairy tales for scared children. But I made a mental note to stay vigilant. There was no telling what truly lurked in those dark woods. The following morning, the town's mayor, Harris, called a meeting to organize the search. The plan was to sweep the forest to locate signs of the pack. Tracks, a den, migration trails, anything. We split into small groups of 3 or 4 hunters to minimize noise while avoiding the danger of traveling alone. Harris assigned each group a specific section of the forest, with a designated rendezvous point for later. The forest itself was unnerving. The tree branches intertwined so densely that sunlight barely filtered through, casting a dim, otherworldly glow over the ground. It felt as though we had stepped into another realm, damp, filled with the scent of decaying leaves, and shrouded in perpetual twilight. Mud squelched underfoot, and occasional puddles dotted the uneven terrain. I kept imagining pairs of glowing wolf eyes watching us from behind the trees. But every time I turned, there was nothing, just the gray trunks and sparse underbrush. The two men in my group, hunters from a neighboring town, walked with their rifles ready, occasionally whispering to each other. The silence was broken only by the crunch of twigs underfoot and the soft murmur of our cautious footsteps. I'd never felt so uneasy in what seemed like an ordinary forest. We felt like prey, trapped in a snare of shadows and ghosts. Little did we know, the true horrors of that place were still lying in wait. Naive as we were, we had no idea of the evil that lurked in those woods. We continued wandering deeper into the forest, sticking to our assigned sector as best we could by following the compass. From time to time, we crouched to examine the ground for paw prints or searched nearby bushes for tufts of fur. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I grew increasingly anxious. We hadn't found a single clue pointing to the wolves' den. Then one of the guys, Will, called out, "Hey, look up ahead. Is that a house?" Sure enough, through the dense trees and thorny undergrowth, a structure came into view. At first glance, it looked like a log cabin, old and weathered. Its blackened wood and slanted roof suggested it had stood there for decades, maybe longer. As we approached, we noticed a narrow path leading to it, scattered with small stones. "Should we check it out?" suggested Tom, a young hunter from the town. "Careful," I replied. "If someone's living here, they might not take kindly to unexpected visitors." As we got closer to the porch, I noticed the windows were covered with tattered cloth. What caught my attention most, however, were the strange symbols carved into the doorframe, runes or pictograms I couldn't decipher. The air around the cabin carried an odd smell, a mix of damp earth, decaying herbs, and something sweetly toxic, like the residue of burned plants. I stepped onto the porch and hesitated before knocking. The sound was dull against the weathered wood and silence followed. Yet, I was certain someone was inside. I knocked again, louder this time, and heard faint movement, a creak of floorboards, soft footsteps. The door opened slightly, and a woman appeared in the doorway. Her appearance was strikingly unusual for these parts. Her long black hair was braided, and necklaces made of bones and feathers hung around her neck. Her gaze was detached, almost distant. She wore a loose, floor-length dress in deep navy blue and regarded us with a calmness that was unsettling, as if she'd been expecting visitors. "Yes?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with an accent I couldn't place. "Ma'am, sorry to bother you," I began. "We're hunters, tracking a pack of wolves that's been terrorizing the area. Have you seen anything unusual?" Her eyes flicked to the rifles we carried, and a faint smile curved her lips. "Wolves," she echoed. "They come through here often, but I don't concern myself with them." Her voice was soft yet firm. "You're hunting them? To kill them?" "Well, yes," I admitted. "They've been attacking livestock, even people. We're trying to protect the town." She was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in. If you want to look around, I won't stop you." Inside, the cabin was even stranger than it looked from the outside. Instead of typical furnishings, shelves lined the walls filled with jars of dried herbs, bone fragments, strange roots, and what looked like animal claws. Dolls made from cloth and bundles of twigs hung from the walls, exuding an air of ritualistic purpose. In the corner stood an altar with lit candles and a stone figurine painted in red. Whether it was meant to represent a god or a demon, I couldn't tell. The smell inside was overpowering, a mix of decay, incense, and swampy dampness. A chill ran down my spine. The atmosphere felt oppressive, almost malevolent. Tom and Will exchanged uneasy glances. Their tense expressions mirrored my own discomfort. We asked if she'd seen any signs of wolves, trails, dens, or anything unusual. She replied that wolves occasionally passed through at night, but she'd never tracked them. Nor was it her concern. She repeated cryptically, "The forest knows who its master is." Her words, laced with ambiguity, sent shivers through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this woman might be the witch Warren had spoken of. She wasn't openly hostile, but her demeanor kept us at arm's length, watchful, calculating. Her eyes darted between our faces as though committing every detail to memory. We thanked her for the information and left as quickly as politeness allowed. As we stepped off the porch, she called out one final remark. "Take care, hunters. The forest doesn't like those who come armed." Once the house disappeared behind the trees, Tom exhaled sharply. "Barely got out of there in one piece. Man, that gave me the creeps." Will nodded, muttering, "Why did we even go in? Those dolls she had gave me chills." I kept my composure, but inside I agreed completely. It felt as though some alien, hostile force had sized us up and let us go, for now. I couldn't accuse her of anything without evidence. For all I knew, she could simply be an eccentric recluse fascinated by ritual practices. But suspicion had taken root in my mind. Warren's story about a witch cast out of the town echoed loudly in my thoughts. The woman's demeanor, her home, her cryptic words, all of it suggested that she might be connected to the horrors unfolding around us. That evening, we decided to set up camp at the designated meeting point, a small clearing where all the hunting groups were supposed to gather. 10 of us made it there initially, while the rest were either still searching their sectors or had returned to the town empty-handed. We built a fire in the center of the clearing with tents arranged in a loose circle around it. Some of the men stoked the flames, hanging a pot of water over the fire. As night fell and heavy clouds blanketed the sky, the warm glow of the fire became a welcome refuge from the cold and damp. The hunters murmured among themselves, exchanging tales of eerie places they had encountered in the past. I sat near Warren, absent-mindedly swirling my mug of hot tea, unable to shake the image of that strange woman from my mind. "That's probably the witch," Warren whispered, leaning closer. "Those voodoo dolls, her rituals. Makes you wonder what else she's hiding." I shrugged in response, unwilling to jump to conclusions without proof of any wrongdoing. By 10 o'clock, the forest had become pitch black. The clearing was surrounded by an impenetrable wall of shadows, punctuated by the occasional rustle or creak of trees. Whether it was the wind or some nocturnal creature, the sounds kept us all on edge. Despite the tension, we tried to relax, knowing a hard day of hunting awaited us. "Hey guys, I'll be right back," said one of the hunters, Ross. He stood, leaving his rifle behind, and walked into the woods for a moment of privacy. No one thought much of it. It was a routine occurrence in such situations. Minutes passed. Ross didn't return. At first, no one was concerned. But after about 15 minutes, another hunter, Jack, volunteered. "I'll go look for him. Maybe he got turned around or something." Jack grabbed his rifle and headed off in the direction Ross had gone. The rest of us stayed by the fire, exchanging uneasy glances and peering into the darkness. An inexplicable dread began to creep over me, a cold knot tightening in my chest. Then, suddenly a scream tore through the night, a piercing, blood-curdling wail of pure terror. The scream didn't come from the direction where Jack had gone, but from somewhere off to the side. We all jumped to our feet, rifles in hand, as fear gripped the group. The firelight flickered on wide, panicked eyes as some of the men muttered frantic questions. What the hell was that? Where did it come from? Before anyone could answer, another scream echoed through the forest, closer this time. And then, silence. A heavy, unnatural quiet fell over the clearing, broken only by the sound of our own breathing. Moments later, Jack stumbled back into camp, pale as a ghost. "I didn't see him," Jack stammered. "I heard the scream, so close, and then nothing. No sign of him, no sound. Just gone." We immediately grabbed torches and lanterns and fanned out to search. The underbrush rustled as we combed through the area, calling Ross's name. Our efforts yielded only a few drops of blood on the grass, barely visible in the faint moonlight, and a trail leading into a dense thicket. The trail abruptly ended, as if Ross had been dragged into the shadows and simply vanished. We tried to follow the faint tracks, but the oppressive darkness and growing fear made it impossible to continue safely. After about 20 minutes, we reluctantly returned to the campfire, agreeing to resume the search at first light. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled around the fire, clutching our rifles, flinching at every crack of a branch or rustle in the undergrowth. The oppressive weight of the forest seemed to press in on us, as if it was alive and watching. When dawn finally broke, the pale light offered some relief, but it did little to dispel the unease. At sunrise, we resumed our search, this time more methodically. We found a smeared trail of blood in the grass, along with torn pieces of Ross's clothing, leading deeper into the forest. The tracks ended near a thick grove of trees, as if whatever had taken him had vanished into thin air. No one said a word, but the grim expressions on our faces betrayed what we all knew. Ross was likely gone for good. There was something malevolent in that forest, a force beyond anything we had encountered before. This was no ordinary wolf hunt. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever was out there, it was watching, waiting, and far more dangerous than any predator I'd faced before. After Ross's disappearance, we were more determined than ever. By midday, 2 more hunters from another group joined our camp. They brought unsettling news. They'd come across an oddly mutilated deer carcass deep in the forest. It didn't match the usual patterns of predator attacks. Our mission remained the same: track the wolf pack and, if possible, avenge Ross. But now we moved with heightened caution. We ventured deeper into the forest, combing through ravines, hollows, and clearings near streams. It became clear that larger animals like deer or elk were becoming scarce. Instead, we found gnawed bones, ancient animal skulls, and evidence suggesting that this forest was dominated by either a single massive wolf pack or a predator so ferocious that it had driven other wildlife away. Occasionally, we spotted ravens circling overhead and approached cautiously, only to find the remains of an animal, or something worse. At one point, we came upon a fox's corpse, with half its body seemingly torn away by something brutally strong. The deeper we went, the more desolate the forest became. The trees stood like lifeless sentinels, their bases surrounded by nothing but poisonous mushrooms and gray moss. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive dampness that made it hard to breathe. From time to time, we stumbled across wolf tracks, but they were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The paw prints were unnaturally large, enough to make even an experienced hunter's blood run cold. These were either wolves of a species unknown to us or a single monstrously oversized creature. As evening fell, we decided to set a trap. Jeremy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with slicked-back graying hair, proposed the idea, "We need to lure them to us. Chasing them deeper into this forest is suicide. Let's use bait." After some discussion, we agreed. Jeremy and another hunter retrieved a goat carcass from a nearby farm at the forest's edge. They sliced off chunks of meat to spread the scent of blood more effectively. We selected a clearing with good visibility and stationed shooters around the perimeter. I took a position on a slight rise, hiding behind the massive trunk of a fallen tree. The goat's carcass was placed in the center of the clearing, and we concealed ourselves as best we could to avoid scaring off any approaching predators. Dusk fell, and an eerie silence descended on the forest. The faint crackle of twigs and the whisper of leaves in the wind were the only sounds. The metallic tang of blood hung in the air, sharp and cloying, making even me uneasy. Gripping our weapons, we sat motionless, waiting. The hours crept by, and some of the men began to fidget, their patience wearing thin. But I was no stranger to waiting. By midnight, the moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the clearing. Suddenly, the forest seemed to stir. We heard the crack of branches nearby, the sound unnervingly close. Every muscle in my body tensed, adrenaline surging through my veins, but nothing emerged. After a few moments, the noise stopped and the woods fell silent again. We remained frozen, ready to fire at the slightest movement. The hours dragged on with no sign of wolves. Just before dawn, we finally retreated to rest, resolving to return to the ambush after lunch. We hoped that the wolves might be more active at twilight or dawn. Frustration hung heavy over the camp as exhaustion set in. Despite our efforts, it felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against us, rendering our hunt fruitless. The next day, closer to noon, we regrouped and set up another ambush in the same clearing. The stench of blood from the carcass had grown stronger overnight. Many of us were visibly uneasy. Everyone understood that these wolves were not ordinary predators, and we had no idea what kind of power they might possess. The sun was high in the sky, but the dim light that filtered through the clouds and tree canopies gave the place a grim, foreboding feel. Birds seemed to avoid the clearing, and the wind barely stirred the leaves. An unnatural, oppressive silence hung in the air. Around 3 in the afternoon, the first wolves emerged from the underbrush. They were large, dark-furred, and moved cautiously, poking their snouts out, sniffing the air. We counted 5 in total. We fought the urge to fire prematurely, knowing we'd scare off the pack. The wolves seemed to sense the bait, but approached reluctantly, circling slowly. Then a few smaller ones appeared at the edge of the clearing. Their eyes burned with hunger as they crept closer to the carcass. We exchanged glances, trying not to betray our presence. We wanted to see the alpha and, if possible, lure it in. About 10 minutes passed before something stepped out from the trees that froze me to my core. It was far taller and bulkier than a normal wolf, with a grotesquely disproportionate body, its hind legs shorter than its front ones, and its back arched like a hunchback. But the most terrifying part wasn't even that. The creature moved more like a humanoid monster, half standing on its hind legs. Its massive head, filled with a mouth of enormous fangs dripping saliva, and its glowing yellow eyes scanned the clearing. It sniffed the air as if sensing us. It was a werewolf. Of that I had no doubt. Before that day, if someone had told me such things existed, I would have laughed. The beast stepped forward, letting out a low growl. The wolves surrounding the carcass retreated a few paces as if waiting for their leader to begin the feast. It approached the dead goat, lowered its enormous head, and tore into the flesh with savage ferocity. Red blood dripped from its fangs, pooling on the grass below. The sight was both horrifying and revolting. My throat went dry and my fingers tightened around my rifle stock. I noticed one of the hunters beside me slightly raise his rifle. In the next instant, a shot rang out. Someone couldn't bear the terror any longer. Maybe their nerves snapped, or maybe it was part of Jeremy's plan. Everything unraveled in what felt like slow motion. The wolves howled, the werewolf lifted its head, its eyes blazing with fury. Blood and foam dripped from its maw as its powerful limbs tensed. We opened fire. Shot after shot. Any ordinary creature would have been dead under such a barrage. But the werewolf, though staggering from the impacts, roared even louder and charged at the nearest hunter. The wolves followed suit, crossing the distance in a flash. At least 2 of our group went down instantly, their dying screams piercing the chaos. I couldn't believe my eyes. Our bullets barely slowed the monstrous creature. I aimed at the werewolf, intending to shoot it in the head. But it leapt, dodging the trajectory. Its fangs flashed, and I heard a sickening crunch. It had sunk its teeth into one of the hunters, likely Jack. The other wolves tackled another man, dragging him into the dirt and ripping at him with claws. Blood sprayed across the grass as an ear-splitting cacophony of growls and howls filled the air. With immense effort, I steadied myself and pulled the trigger. A shot. The bullet struck the werewolf, but it barely reacted. Instead, it snarled, baring its fangs, and lunged forward. Another hunter fell, shredded by its claws. The entire scene played out in mere minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Our ambush had devolved into a bloody nightmare. Sweat poured down my face, and my heart pounded like a runaway engine. We tried to retreat, firing as we ran. Some didn't even manage that. They turned and bolted into the woods, praying they wouldn't be caught. The pack of wolves pursued us, their chilling howls echoing through the forest. It felt as though the woods had closed in, turning into a trap with no escape. But somehow, using the trees for cover, we managed to break free and sprint toward the settlement. The wolves fell back, as if unwilling to leave their territory. When we finally stumbled out onto the meadow at the edge of the forest, barely alive, there were only 4 of us left. 4 out of 12. Imagine that. What had started as a profitable hunt had turned into a living hell. We returned to the town late in the evening, battered, bloodied, and wounded, both physically and mentally. It felt as if nightmares were chasing us, and we had no idea what to do next. The townsfolk greeted us, and when they saw that we were the only ones who made it back, many gasped, while others simply shook their heads, muttering, "It's a curse." The town leader, Harris, hurried over, bombarding us with questions about what had happened. When we told him what we'd seen, how bullets couldn't harm that hellish creature, he looked as though he might faint. We were certain this was no ordinary pack of wolves. We had encountered a werewolf, a monster born of dark sorcery. No other creature could survive so many bullets and tear apart so many men in mere minutes. The wolf pack seemed to follow this beast as their alpha, obedient to its commands. That very night, the town suffered another attack. Wolves approached the outskirts, raiding a farmer's livestock, while the werewolf, according to witnesses, leapt into a yard and snatched a dog, clearing a fence over 6 feet tall in a single bound. We surviving hunters tried to fend them off, managing to kill a few ordinary wolves, but the werewolf escaped, seemingly invincible. The situation felt hopeless. Suddenly, I remembered the witch, her eerie, unsettling home, and the way she spoke about the forest knowing who its master was. It all clicked. Could she be connected to this? My gut told me yes. I voiced my thoughts to Harris and the remaining hunters. We need to find that woman. She's a witch. I'm sure of it. She's behind all this, or at least tied to it. If we can break the curse or stop her magic, maybe the werewolf will weaken. They looked at me like I was insane. But after some thought, they agreed. It was a terrifying but logical conclusion. Ordinary bullets couldn't kill the werewolf, so our only chance was to confront the witch. At that point, we had nothing left to lose. The problem was there were only 4 of us left. That night, one of the hunters succumbed to his wounds, a man mauled by the wolves. The town doctor did everything he could, but it wasn't enough. By morning, only 3 of us remained, me, Warren, and Jeremy. Exhausted but determined, we set out into the forest. Reaching the witch's house was no easy task. The weather turned foul, with a light, chilling rain drizzling over us. We trudged through muddy paths, constantly on edge, fearing the wolves, or worse, the werewolf, would ambush us. But the forest was eerily silent. When we finally saw the familiar log cabin, a shiver ran through me, though I tried to appear calm. The house was as dark as before. We knocked, more out of politeness than necessity, and pushed the door open. It swung inward on its own. Inside, the room was dimly lit by just a couple of candles. The same pungent mix of herbs, smoke, and decay filled the air. We stepped into the main room, where a sinister altar stood, and spotted the woman, the witch, hunched by the hearth. Warren said, "Enough of your spells, witch! What have you done to these lands?" The woman slowly turned her head toward us. Her eyes glowed faintly red, and her features seemed sharper, almost inhuman. "You returned," she hissed, rising to her feet. "Why?" She straightened, raising her arms, and I noticed strange markings on her skin beneath her tattered dress. Amulets jingled softly like tiny bells. "It's you! The wolves! The werewolf! The curse! It's all because of you!" Jeremy shouted, aiming his rifle at her. "You have to stop this!" She laughed, a chilling, unnatural sound, as though multiple voices echoed from her throat. Her body began to shift. Dark patches spread across her skin, her hands lengthened, fingers ending in sharp claws. Like a shadow stretching, she grew taller and transformed into something demonic. Her face retained a hint of humanity, but spikes and bone-like protrusions jutted from beneath her skin. "You fools," the demon hissed. "You don't understand. It's not me. The forest itself rules these creatures. I am merely its servant." A sudden gust of wind snuffed out the candles, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by flashes of otherworldly energy radiating from the witch. I struggled to keep hold of my rifle. Warren fired first, but the bullet seemed to do little more than provoke her. She shrieked and lunged at him with inhuman speed. Her claws slashed into his side, and he screamed, swinging his rifle like a club. Jeremy sprang forward with a knife, driving it into her back. She jerked violently, letting out a piercing screech, and flung him aside like a rag doll. I found myself standing between her and my fallen comrades. Time seemed to slow. I raised my rifle, aimed for her head, and fired. The bullet struck true, and for a moment I thought it was over. But no. The demon staggered, grabbed a staff from the wall, and struck me across the legs, knocking me to the floor. "Fools," she hissed. "You cannot kill what dwells in the shadows of the night. I am part of this forest." Warren, writhing in pain, let his hunting knife slip from his grasp. Jeremy struggled to stand, but the witch advanced on him, snarling and baring her jagged teeth. It seemed hopeless. But as she loomed over him, I pushed past the agony, aimed again, and fired a second shot. This time, the bullet struck her chest. She let out a monstrous roar, arching her back. Black blood and writhing tendrils spilled from beneath her dress, slithering like dying serpents. We didn't stop. Jeremy drove his knife into her again and again, while I reloaded and fired a third shot. In the madness of it all, time seemed frozen. I could no longer grasp how we were even fighting a demonic creature that, just moments ago, had been a woman. Finally, the witch let out an ear-piercing shriek, convulsed violently, and collapsed to the floor. Her flesh began to wither rapidly, like parchment crumbling to ash. I couldn't look away as the monster shrank, its body desiccating until it became nothing more than an empty husk. The skin split apart, leaving behind a hollow, snake-like shell and a pool of rotting black ichor. The stench of death filled the room. We stood there, gasping for breath, bloodied and barely alive. But we knew we had killed the witch. I helped Jeremy to his feet, while Warren, curled on the floor, groaned weakly, clutching his wounded side. He had taken the worst of it, but at least we were alive. And we dared to hope that, along with her death, the curse that plagued these lands had been broken. Gathering what strength we had left, we stumbled out of the house, dragging our feet. The rain was still falling, but we barely noticed it. We did our best to dress Warren's wounds. Then we set the cabin ablaze. I wasn't certain it would destroy all of her dark artifacts, but it felt like the safest option. Flames quickly consumed the log walls, and thick black smoke billowed into the overcast sky. It was as if nature itself recoiled in anger, lashing out with rain as the fire raged. The trek back to town took hours. I forced us onward, clinging to the hope that the werewolf, stripped of its magical tether, would no longer be a threat. But I couldn't have imagined what awaited us upon our return. When we finally stumbled into the outskirts, exhausted and half dead, we were greeted by a dozen townsfolk armed with spears and rifles. Harris stood among them, his face lined with worry. Before we could begin explaining, a young man emerged from the center of the street, a boy everyone had thought long dead. He stood trembling, his eyes wide with terror, as if awakening from a nightmare. But something about him was off. His face would periodically twist in pain or rage, and his eyes glinted with an animalistic ferocity. My heart sank. Could it be? Was he the werewolf? Everything fit. He hadn't been found because he had been under the witch's thrall, transformed into a creature of the night. And now, with her death, he had returned to human form, though the curse clearly hadn't been fully lifted. Harris ordered the townsfolk to back away as we approached the boy, unsteady on our feet. He looked lost and frail, perhaps unaware of, or unable to admit to, his monstrous deeds. What could be done with someone like him? Killing him on the spot would make us murderers. Letting him live would risk everyone's safety if the werewolf re-emerged. Later, I learned the boy had been the witch's lover. I never found out what the townsfolk decided. That day, Harris ordered the boy surrounded and asked us to leave, warning us to keep silent about what we had seen. "This town has suffered enough," he said. "We don't need any more rumors spreading." I suspect they hid the truth. Perhaps they locked the boy in a cage, trying to lift the curse, or perhaps they dealt with him more harshly. Either way, the story was buried. No one from the town ever spoke of those days again, and we surviving hunters swore never to tell the full tale. But I break that vow now because I believe such a story must not be lost. People need to know that forests can conceal truly horrifying things. It's been 50 years. I often think back to those grim days when I came to that town, naively hoping to earn a living and help its people. Many friends and fellow hunters were lost in that cursed forest. Wolves? Werewolves? Witches? I thought they were just myths until I saw them with my own eyes. Sometimes, I still dream of those wolfish eyes, burning with primal rage, and of the demon in a woman's guise, whispering spells from the shadows. I don't know what became of the boy who was the werewolf. Perhaps he's long dead. Or perhaps he still roams the woods at night, hiding from human sight. But one thing I know for certain. Somewhere in those dark thickets, dark magic still lingers, and forces beyond human understanding continue to exist. If you ever find yourself in such a desolate place and hear a strange howl in the distance, run. Run without looking back. For not every hunter, no matter how skilled, can survive a clash with the evil that lurks in the depths of the night. Story 2. I work for the local search and rescue team in a small town bordering vast forests. Our town is tiny. One gas station with a bar, a 2-story administrative building, and a couple of shops lining the main street. The surrounding area is an endless sprawl of wilderness, with forests climbing low mountains and sinking into valleys that few have ever traversed. Some of the older residents call this region the backyard of the Appalachians, though we're not officially in the heart of the mountains. It's late at night, and I'm sitting by an open window in my small apartment. The wind rustles through the pine tops, carrying a faint whisper that's hard to place, a mix of creaking trees and the distant echo of unidentifiable voices. The stars are hidden behind thick clouds, and the dim glow of moonlight barely cuts through the darkness. From the street below, the hum of a lone street lamp reaches my ears. The light flickers nervously, as though it too senses something is wrong. Lately, there's been a string of disappearances in our town. At first, we chalked it up to careless tourists losing their way in the woods, wandering off without maps or compasses. But when seasoned locals started vanishing, and our search routes led to dead ends filled with strange, unexplained clues, unease began to creep into all of us. I want to share a recent search mission, a case involving an experienced outdoorsman who knew these forests better than anyone. His disappearance marked a turning point for me, the moment I realized something in these woods defies normal understanding. Even as I sit here, listening to the wind and the groaning trees, I can't shake the feeling that an unseen force is watching from the shadows, making my pulse race. It was midday when our rescue station received the call. Richard Stanton, a regular hiker and a well-known figure in the area, was missing. Richard often guided novice hikers, showing them trails and sharing his expertise. He was even registered as a volunteer with the local forest reserve, helping mark hazardous sections of trails. When someone like him didn't check in, we knew something was seriously wrong. We assembled in less than an hour. Gear was packed into the ATV: first aid kits, ropes, flashlights, GPS trackers, radios. We headed to the location where Richard was last known to have started his hike. His plan had been straightforward: hike a few kilometers east of an old logging site, follow the stream down, and connect to a neighboring trail. Nothing unusual, yet there hadn't been a single signal from him. When we arrived at the trailhead, the first strange sign greeted us: a small roll of red marking tape lay discarded on the path. Richard always carried tape to mark trails for others, and we spotted red strips tied to trees along the route, freshly cut with his knife. This wasn't unusual. Experienced hikers use markers to ensure they don't miss turns. But our concern deepened when we realized the marked trail didn't match the route Richard had planned. We followed the red markers deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller, their canopy thicker, and the ground beneath us turned damp. Decaying leaves squelched underfoot and the air grew cooler. Along the way, we found scraps of paper and bits of plastic, but none of it pointed to Richard's whereabouts. We radioed back to the station multiple times, reporting no signs of a campsite, no remnants of a fire, no belongings. Just these increasingly eerie red markers leading us further into the dense forest. Hours passed. Exhaustion crept in, but we pressed on. The later it got, the more dangerous it became to navigate, and we knew nightfall would bring even greater risks. As the light began to fade, we stumbled into a clearing strewn with fallen trees. It was there that the markers took a bizarre turn. Red strips were everywhere. They hung from branches, looped around trunks, and draped across fallen logs. It looked as if someone had used an entire roll of tape, methodically placing it in a pattern. The sheer density of the markers was unsettling. No longer a practical trail guide, but something that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. We stopped, staring at the scene in uneasy silence. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. "Damn it," muttered one of my colleagues. "Feels like someone's leading us in circles." I couldn't disagree. The glaring red strips were everywhere, and in the beam of our flashlights, they looked like crimson smears, as if marking a blood-soaked trail for some twisted game. As I approached one of the trees, a foul odor hit me, a mix of dampness and decay. Somewhere nearby, I could hear the sound of running water, likely a tributary of the creek. But the air carried something else, a faint, putrid stench that made my stomach churn. I scanned the area, tense, but saw no animal bones, no signs of human activity. Only these unnervingly precise, freshly tied strips of red tape. No one said it aloud, but we all felt it in that moment. The creeping wrongness of what we were seeing. Richard was a practical man. He'd never waste tape like this, let alone tie it in such a chaotic and excessive manner. Unless someone was following him, or forcing him to do it. We pressed on, picking a direction at random. The red markers led us into a small copse of trees where the undergrowth grew thick. It was there that we finally found something, boot prints. They matched Richard's, or so we believed, based on the tread pattern we all recognized from his preferred hiking boots. The tracks were short and close together, as if he'd been running or moving quickly. But they ended abruptly. We scoured the area, searching for any signs of a struggle, blood, or even a scuffle. Nothing. Just an empty patch of earth and an unsettling silence that pressed down on us. By the time the sun had set and the sky deepened to a dark blue, we had no choice but to make camp. We all knew the grim reality. If Richard was injured and still alive, his chances of survival were dwindling fast. That night was torturous. We huddled around the fire, shifting uneasily and trying to ignore the oppressive thoughts weighing on us. The sounds of the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling, felt sharp and intrusive. Every noise made someone flinch. A few of the team speculated that Richard might have fallen victim to illegal squatters or hermits in the woods. But deep down, I felt something far more sinister was at play, something inexplicable and dangerous. At first light, we resumed the search, pushing several kilometers further into the forest. But the scene was always the same. Dozens of red ribbons tied to trees, often in places that made no sense. Some were tied high on branches, others looped around trunks in seemingly random patterns. By midday, it became clear that the markers weren't guiding anyone. They were meant to confuse us, to drain our time and energy. After 2 days, the official search was called off. No witnesses, no evidence, no leads. The local authorities ordered the ribbons to be removed from the trees, citing safety concerns. too many tourists might get misled by them. But as some of my colleagues began the task of stripping the forest of the markers, a new wave of dread washed over us. No matter how many ribbons we removed, more seemed to appear. It was as if someone, or something, kept coming back each night to replace them. Richard Stanton was never found, neither alive nor dead. His disappearance marked the first time such an experienced outdoorsman vanished in our area with no trace. But what haunted us most weren't the ribbons themselves. It was the way they seemed to lead beyond the edge of reason, into a place we couldn't understand. After that mission, I started looking at the shadows beneath the pines differently. Every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees, a shiver runs down my spine. I can't help but imagine a flash of red ribbon flickering in the distance, a silent warning, or an invitation to something much darker. And now, as I sit by my window, I can clearly hear the forest's whisper. It's like a sinister lullaby, a constant reminder of what happened. Deep down, I know the disappearances will continue, because whoever or whatever is placing those ribbons hasn't stopped. Maybe it's the forest itself, steeped in some ancient malevolence, luring people deeper and deeper into its depths. Or maybe the red tape is a warning, or worse, a trap, inviting the unwary into a darkness they'll never escape. Story 3. A few weeks ago, we received an urgent call late at night. A local resident, Joseph McLean, had stumbled out of the woods and onto a rural road, flagging down the driver of a passing pickup truck. The driver brought him straight to our station. When we saw Joseph, he was slumped in a chair, clutching a blanket to his chest, his entire body trembling. His lips quivered, and his eyes darted around feverishly, as if he were still seeing whatever had terrified him. I sat beside him to listen to his story, and it burned itself into my memory like a chilling scar. Joseph explained that he had decided to take a shortcut through the forest to get home from a neighboring village. It wasn't the first time he'd taken that path. He'd walked it countless times before. But this time, he left his friends later than usual, and nightfall caught him mid-journey. At first, everything seemed normal as he followed the familiar trail. Then, he realized he was lost. It was like the trees had rearranged themselves, he whispered, his voice breaking. Before long, strange sounds reached his ears. A loud, sharp cracking as if someone were breaking massive branches or even entire tree trunks. The snapping and dull thuds came from somewhere ahead, deep between the trees. It was as though something enormous was tearing through the forest. Trying to avoid the noise, Joseph veered onto a different path. But soon, the cracking sounds gave way to an entirely different noise, a deep, steady hum. It was mechanical, like the droning of industrial equipment, yet impossibly out of place in the middle of the woods. There were no logging operations, no construction sites, and certainly no machinery nearby. The hum reverberated through the trees, filling the air around him, pressing in from all sides. Terrified, Joseph quickened his pace, but then the ground beneath him became soft and treacherous, as if invisible hands were dragging him downward into the earth. "I fell to my knees," he stammered, and that's when I heard it. A voice, quiet but insistent, urging me to stay. He described the words as crawling under his skin, like a spell designed to pull him deeper into the forest. At the same time, the hum grew deafening, and the cracking sound seemed to follow him, as though a colossal unseen figure was moving closer. Feeling his strength slipping away, Joseph began crawling toward a faint glimmer of light he'd spotted through the trees, a break in the forest that he prayed was the road. As soon as he reached the edge of the woods, all the sounds vanished. No cracking, no humming, just the familiar chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. A few more staggering steps, and the headlights of a pickup truck illuminated his pale, terror-stricken face. The driver, without asking any questions, pulled him into the cab and brought him straight to us. "It wanted me to stay," Joseph repeated, clutching my hand with a grip that belied his exhaustion. His lips trembled as he described the voice, soft, commanding, and impossible to resist. After our doctor examined him and determined he was physically unharmed, we sent Joseph home. But both he and everyone who heard his story knew the truth. The forest had no intention of letting him leave. He'd escaped only because he'd managed to crawl to the edge in time. Now, as I stand on the station's front steps, staring into the dark expanse of trees beyond, I can't shake the thought that something is out there in the depths of the forest. A force capable of breaking not just trees, but human will.